3 days ago, I found a notebook hidden in my mother's desk drawer. My name was written at the top in her careful handwriting, followed by words that made my blood run cold. Documented episodes of erratic behavior, witness statements collected, and involuntary commitment procedures. They weren't planning an intervention. They were planning to have me declared mentally unstable. But what they didn't know was that I'd been planning something too. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning it all began, I was standing in our kitchen in Scottsdale, making coffee while my sister Madison livestreamed her morning routine to her 30,000 followers. She had her ring light perfectly positioned, casting that artificial glow that made everything look like a magazine cover. I moved quietly around her setup, careful not to disturb the carefully curated chaos of her authentic morning moment. "Good morning, beautiful souls," Madison chirped into her phone, her voice taking on that particular cadence reserved for social media. "Today, I'm sharing my 5-step morning ritual that literally changed my life." She held up a crystal, then a green smoothie, then some overpriced journal she'd been sponsored to promote. I poured my coffee into a plain white mug and leaned against the counter, watching this performance I'd witnessed hundreds of times. Our mother, Patricia, hovered nearby like a stage manager, occasionally moving items into better lighting or adjusting Madison's hair. Our father, David, sat at the breakfast table scrolling through his tablet, nodding approvingly whenever Madison mentioned family values or blessed to have such support. The funny thing was, 6 months ago, I would have felt invisible in that moment. I would have apologized for existing in their space, maybe even left the room entirely. But something had shifted in me recently. Maybe it was the way they'd been acting around me lately, all whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, all meaningful glances exchanged over my head. Maybe it was the growing certainty that something was wrong, something bigger than their usual dismissiveness. "And the most important part of any morning routine," Madison continued, gesturing dramatically, "is surrounding yourself with positive energy. Some people just carry negativity wherever they go, and you have to protect your peace." Her eyes flicked toward me for just a second, a practiced move that her followers wouldn't even notice, but that I felt like a physical blow. I took a slow sip of my coffee, studying her through the steam. Madison had always been the golden child, the one whose dreams mattered, whose feelings were valid, whose future was worth investing in. At 22, she'd built a lifestyle brand around being the perfect daughter, the grateful sister, the family's shining example of success. Her Instagram feed was a carefully curated museum of our family's best moments, all soft lighting and inspirational quotes. What her followers didn't see were the moments between the posts, the way she'd convinced our parents that my anxiety was attention-seeking behavior, the way she'd suggested that my preference for quiet activities over her social events meant I was antisocial and possibly depressed, the way she'd started documenting every time I seemed tired, every moment I preferred to stay home, every instance when I didn't match her relentless positivity. "Speaking of positive energy," she said, seamlessly transitioning to her next talking point, "I'm so excited to announce that I'm partnering with my family on a new project. We're launching something really special together, something that's going to help so many people. I can't reveal all the details yet, but let's just say we're combining wellness, family values, and financial empowerment in a way that's never been done before." I froze, coffee mug halfway to my lips. Partnership? Project? This was the first I'd heard of any family business venture. I looked at my parents, expecting to see surprise on their faces, but they were both smiling proudly. Whatever this project was, I was clearly the only one in the dark. After Madison finished her stream, she bounced over to where I stood, her energy still artificially heightened from performing. "Alex, "We need to talk to you about something exciting," she said, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Mom, Dad, should we sit down?" They migrated to the living room, our parents settling onto the cream-colored sectional, while Madison perched on the edge of the coffee table, still glowing from her successful live stream. I remained standing, coffee mug in hand, every instinct telling me to stay mobile. "Sweetheart," my mother began, using the tone she reserved for delivering news she knew I wouldn't like. "We've been talking, and we think it's time for you to take a step back from some of your responsibilities." "What responsibilities?" I asked. I worked remotely as a technical writer for a software company, paid my own bills, and barely asked them for anything beyond a place to live while I saved money for my own apartment. "Well, your job, for starters," my father said, adjusting his glasses. "You've been under a lot of stress lately. We've all noticed it. The long hours, the isolation, the way you've been withdrawing from family activities." I blinked at him. "I work normal hours, and I'm not withdrawing from anything. I just don't want to be filmed for Madison's content every time I try to eat breakfast." Madison laughed, but it sounded sharp. "See? This is exactly what we're talking about. You're so defensive lately. Everything is an attack in your mind." "We're worried about you, honey," my mother continued. "Your behavior has been concerning. The way you question everything we say, the way you isolate yourself, the mood swings." "What mood swings?" I asked, genuinely confused. I'd been quieter. Lately, sure, but that was because I'd been feeling increasingly unwelcome in my own home. "And what do you mean? Step back from my job?" "We think you need time to focus on your mental health," my father said. "We've been doing some research, and there are excellent facilities that specialize in helping young adults who are struggling with adjustment disorders and family relationship issues." The words hit me like ice water. Facilities. They were talking about sending me somewhere. "I don't have an adjustment disorder," I said slowly, "and I'm not struggling with anything except feeling like a stranger in my own house." "Denial is very common," Madison said gently, as if she'd rehearsed. "This line, 'We just want what's best for you, Alex. We love you too much to watch you spiral like this.'" I set my coffee mug down on the nearest surface, buying myself time to think. Something about this conversation felt choreographed, like they'd planned exactly what to say and when to say it. The way Madison kept glancing at our parents for approval, the way they kept using clinical language like adjustment disorder and concerning behavior. "What kind of facilities?" I asked. "Residential treatment centers," my mother said. "Places where you can get the help you need without the stress of daily responsibilities. We've already looked into a few options." "You've already looked into options? Without talking to me?" "We didn't want to worry you until we knew more," my father said. "But there's one place in particular that seems perfect. It's in Utah. Beautiful mountain setting, very holistic approach. They specialize in helping young adults who've lost their way." Utah. Hours from anywhere I knew anyone. Away from my job, my independence, my ability to leave if I wanted to. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my stomach. "I haven't lost my way," I said quietly. "I'm 24 years old. I have a job. I pay my bills. I don't use drugs or drink excessively or do anything that would require residential treatment. Why are you talking about this like it's already decided?" "It's not decided," Madison said quickly. "We're just exploring options." "But Alex, you have to admit that you haven't been yourself lately. The way you've been questioning our family dynamic, the way you've been pulling away from us emotionally, it's like you don't trust us anymore." That last sentence landed, with particular weight, because she was right. I didn't trust them anymore, but not for the reasons they were suggesting. For months, I'd been noticing small things, conversations that stopped when I walked into rooms, documents left open on laptops that were quickly closed when I appeared, phone calls taken in other rooms, always in hushed tones. My mail being opened before I could get to it, supposedly by accident. Questions about my work schedule, my savings account, my relationship status that felt more like data collection than family interest. And then, there were the bigger things. The way Madison had started casually mentioning my episodes in her content, vague references to family challenges, and supporting loved ones through difficult times. The way my parents had suddenly become interested in my mental health, asking, probing questions about my stress levels and suggesting I might benefit from talking to someone. The way they'd started treating my normal introverted tendencies like symptoms of something pathological. "I need some air," I said, heading toward the sliding door that led to our backyard patio. "See?" I heard Madison say behind me. "She can't even handle a normal family conversation. She just runs away." I stepped outside and closed the door behind me, grateful for the dry Arizona heat and the silence. Our backyard was typical suburban perfection, all desert landscaping and a pool that sparkled in the morning sun. I sat down on one of the patio chairs and tried to process what had just happened. They wanted to send me to a residential facility in Utah for problems I didn't have, exhibiting behaviors that were either normal or completely fabricated. And they'd already been researching options without telling me, which meant this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment concern. This was planned. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search for residential treatment centers in Utah. What I found made my heart race. Most of them required either voluntary admission or involuntary commitment proceedings. For someone to be committed involuntarily, there had to be documentation of mental health episodes, witness statements about concerning behavior, evidence that the person was a danger to themselves or others. Documentation, witness statements, evidence. I thought about Madison's recent content, the casual mentions of family stress and supporting someone through mental health struggles. I thought about my parents' sudden interest in my emotional state, their careful questions that now seemed designed to elicit specific responses. I thought about the way they'd been treating my normal reactions to their treatment of me like symptoms of instability. They weren't just planning to send me somewhere. They were building a case to send me somewhere against my will. My hands were shaking as I stood up and walked back toward the house. Through the sliding door, I could see them still clustered in the living room, heads together, talking in low voices. Planning. Always planning. I slipped back inside, trying to keep my expression neutral. "I'm going to go think about everything you said," I told them. "This is a lot to process." "Of course, sweetheart," my mother said, her relief visible. "Take all the time you need. We just want you to know that we're here for you, whatever you decide." Whatever I decided, as if I actually had a choice in the matter. I went upstairs, to my room and closed the door, then immediately started looking for evidence of what I was beginning to suspect. It didn't take long to find it. My laptop browser history showed searches I hadn't made. Signs of mental breakdown in young adults. How to help someone who refuses treatment. Involuntary commitment procedures. Arizona. Someone had been using my computer to research my own potential institutionalization. I checked my phone next, scrolling through my recent activity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. There were screenshots I hadn't taken, photos of text conversations I'd had with friends, images of my social media posts. Someone had been documenting my digital life, looking for evidence of instability or concerning behavior. The more I looked, the more I found. My journal had been moved from where I'd left it on my nightstand. The notebook where I kept track of my work assignments had been photographed, the pages slightly out of order. Even my prescription bottles had been rearranged, as if someone had been cataloging my medications. They'd been building a file on me, collecting evidence, documenting my behavior, creating a paper trail that would support their narrative of my declining mental health. I sat on my bed, surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal, and felt something shift inside me. Not the broken, desperate feeling I might have expected. Something colder, sharper, more determined. If they wanted to play games with documentation and evidence, I could play too. But I wouldn't be playing defense. I opened my laptop and started my own research. Not about treatment centers or mental health facilities, but about my legal rights. About what documentation would be required for involuntary commitment. About what evidence would be needed to counter their claims. About how to protect myself legally and financially from people who were supposed to love me. As I researched, a plan began to form. Not a panicked escape or a desperate confrontation, but something methodical and careful. Something they wouldn't see coming because they'd underestimated me so completely. They thought I was broken, isolated, dependent on them for stability and support. They thought I was easy to manipulate, easy to gaslight, easy to control. They were about to find out how wrong they were. But first, I needed to know exactly what they were planning. I needed to see their documentation, their timeline, their complete strategy. I needed to understand the full scope of what I was up against before I could plan my own countermove. So I did what any good researcher would do. I started gathering intelligence. That evening, while they thought I was sulking in my room, I crept downstairs and began my investigation. I started with my mother's desk, the same one where she kept her important papers and household files. I'd helped her organize it countless times over the years, so I knew exactly where she kept things. It was in the bottom drawer, filed under Medical Family in a manila folder labeled with my name. Inside was everything I'd suspected and more. Printed emails between my parents and Madison, discussing my concerning behavior patterns. Screenshots of my social media posts with handwritten notes about mood indicators and social isolation signs. A timeline of what they called incidents, including normal things like staying home on weekends, expressing frustration with Madison's filming, and choosing to eat dinner in my room instead of performing happiness for her content. But the most chilling document was a typed summary titled Alexandra Thompson, Behavioral Assessment and Intervention Recommendations. It read like a clinical evaluation, complete with diagnostic language and treatment suggestions. At the bottom was a signature I didn't recognize, someone named Dr. Richard Hayes, followed by a note in my mother's handwriting. Initial consultation completed. Formal evaluation scheduled pending family intervention. They'd already consulted with a doctor. Without my knowledge, without my consent, they'd spoken to a mental health professional about having me evaluated for involuntary treatment. I photographed every page with my phone, being careful to keep the documents in the exact order I'd found them. Then I kept looking. In another folder, I found financial documents I'd never seen before. Insurance information related to mental health coverage, research about the costs of residential treatment, and most disturbingly, paperwork related to my grandmother's trust fund. My grandmother, Helen Thompson, had died 2 years ago and left me a substantial inheritance. The money was in a trust that I'd gain full control of when I turned 25, which was in 8 months. Until then, my parents were the trustees, able to make decisions about the funds only for my education, health, or welfare. According to the documents I found, they'd already spoken to the trust administrator about using the funds for my mental health treatment. They'd received preliminary approval to access the money for residential care, pending a formal psychiatric evaluation and treatment recommendation. Suddenly, their motivation became crystal clear. This wasn't just about control or Madison's social media brand. This was about money. My money. If they could have me declared mentally unstable and committed to long-term residential treatment, they could access my inheritance to pay for it. And if the treatment lasted long enough, if they could keep me in the system past my 25th birthday, they might be able to maintain control of the funds indefinitely. I sat in my mother's chair, surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal, and felt a cold clarity settle over me. They weren't trying to help me. They were trying to steal from me. and they were willing to destroy my life, my reputation, and my freedom to do it. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated me completely. I carefully returned everything to its proper place, turned off the desk lamp, and crept back upstairs. In my room, I transferred all the photos to a secure cloud storage account they couldn't access, then began planning my real response. I had 8 months until my 25th birthday. 8 months until I gained full control of my inheritance. 8 months to build my own case, gather my own evidence, and plan my own escape. They thought they were playing chess while I was playing checkers. But the truth was, I'd been learning the rules of their game for months without even realizing it. Now I was ready to play to win. The next morning, I went downstairs for breakfast with a completely different energy. Calm, cooperative, even slightly apologetic. "I've been thinking about what you all said yesterday," I told them as I poured myself coffee. "And I think you might be right. I have been stressed lately, and maybe I do need some help." The relief on their faces was immediate and obvious. Madison actually clapped her hands together. "Oh, Alex, I'm so glad you're being open to this," my mother said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "We just want what's best for you." "I know," I said, squeezing back. "I was hoping we could take it slow, though. Maybe start with some outpatient counseling before we consider anything residential." "Of course," my father said quickly. "We want you to feel comfortable with whatever we decide." "Actually," I continued, "I was thinking I could even look into some options myself, do my own research, find someone I feel comfortable talking to. Would that be okay?" They exchanged glances, and I could see them calculating. This wasn't exactly what they'd planned, but it was movement in their direction. And if I was the one choosing the therapist, I couldn't later claim I'd been forced into treatment. "That sounds very mature," Madison said. "Very responsible." "Great," I said with a smile that felt like putting on a mask. "I'll start looking into it this week." What I was actually going to start doing was building my own documentation. If they wanted to play the game of psychological evaluation and behavioral assessment, I could play it too. But I'd be collecting evidence of their manipulation, their financial motivation, and their systematic campaign to make me doubt my own sanity. I had work to do, and they had no idea what was coming. Over the next 3 weeks, I played the role of the compliant daughter while secretly building my exit strategy. Every morning, I came downstairs with a smile and asked how I could help with breakfast. I participated in Madison's content when she asked, always appearing grateful and supportive. I even started therapy with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a licensed counselor I'd carefully researched and chosen specifically because she had experience with family manipulation and financial abuse. What my family didn't know was that Dr. Martinez was helping me document their behavior from a clinical perspective. She was teaching me about psychological manipulation tactics, helping me understand the gaslighting techniques they'd been using, and most importantly, she was creating her own professional assessment of my mental health that directly contradicted their narrative. During our sessions, I would record detailed accounts of my family's behavior, their attempts to reframe my normal responses as symptoms, and their escalating pressure for me to consider residential treatment. Dr. Martinez took careful notes, and she'd already written a preliminary assessment stating that I showed no signs of mental illness, adjustment disorders, or any condition that would require inpatient treatment. Meanwhile, I was quietly building my escape plan. I'd opened a new bank account at a different institution, one my parents had no connection to. Every week, I transferred small amounts from my checking account, amounts too small to trigger any attention, but large enough to build a substantial emergency fund. I researched apartments in Denver, a city I'd always loved but had never mentioned, to my family. I looked into remote work opportunities that would allow me to maintain my income while living somewhere completely new. Most importantly, I was documenting everything they did. Every time one of them searched my room, I took photos of the evidence before and after. Every time they had hushed conversations that stopped when I appeared, I noted the time and context. When Madison made vague references to family challenges in her content, I screenshot every post. When my parents scheduled what they thought were secret phone calls with Dr. Hayes, I recorded the times and durations. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening in late October. I was supposed to be at my therapy session with Dr. Martinez, but she'd had to reschedule at the last minute. Instead of calling home to let them know, I decided to grab dinner and come back at my usual time. What I found when I quietly entered through the garage door changed everything. They were having a meeting in our dining room, the formal one we only used for special occasions. Sitting around the polished wooden table were my parents, Madison, and 3 people I didn't recognize. I could see them through the archway between the kitchen and dining room, but they couldn't see me as I stood frozen by the garage entrance. "The timeline is crucial," a woman in a navy suit was saying. "If we're going to proceed with involuntary commitment proceedings, we need documented evidence of a psychological crisis that poses a danger to herself or others." Involuntary commitment proceedings. The words hit me like a physical blow. "How do we create that kind of documentation?" my father asked. "You don't create it," the woman replied firmly. "That would be fraud. But you can document concerning behaviors as they naturally occur. Has she shown any signs of paranoia, aggression, or self-destructive behavior?" "She's become very suspicious lately," Madison offered. "Always questioning our motives, accusing us of going through her things. And she's been isolating herself more and more." "That's good," the woman said, making notes. "Paranoid ideation and social withdrawal are both indicators we can use. Have there been any episodes of anger or emotional dysregulation?" "She raised her voice at Madison last week," my mother said. "She seemed very agitated about something trivial." I remembered that moment clearly. Madison had been filming in my room without permission, going through my belongings as props for her sister's room tour content. I'd asked her to stop and leave, and when she ignored me, I'd spoken more firmly. That was the episode of anger. They were now framing as emotional dysregulation. "Perfect," the woman continued. "Dr. Hayes will need at least 3 documented incidents that demonstrate a pattern of concerning behavior. The family intervention session we have scheduled for next week should provide the catalyst we need." Family intervention session. I pressed myself closer to the wall, straining to hear every word. "Remember," another voice said, this one belonging to a thin man in glasses, "the goal is to demonstrate that Alexandra is unable to make rational decisions about her own welfare. We need her to refuse treatment in a way that seems unreasonable and dangerous. Dr. Hayes will interpret this refusal as confirmation of her compromised mental state." "And then we can proceed with the commitment order?" my father asked. "Exactly. Once she's been evaluated and placed in residential care, the Trust Administration will approve the use of her inheritance funds for treatment costs. Given the severity of the case we're building, we're looking at long-term residential placement, possibly 18 to 24 months. 18 to 24 months. They were planning to lock me away for up to 2 years, well past my 25th birthday, well past the point where I would gain control of my own money." "What about her job?" Madison asked. "Won't her employer ask questions if she just disappears?" "We'll handle that," the woman assured her. "Mental health leave is protected under federal law. Her employer can't discriminate against her for seeking treatment. In fact, we'll frame it as the family helping her maintain her employment by getting her the help she needs." I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to breathe slowly and quietly. They had thought of everything. They had lawyers. They had a doctor willing to rubber stamp their false diagnosis. They had a complete timeline and strategy. But they didn't know I was listening. "The intervention is scheduled for Tuesday," the woman continued. "Madison, you'll document the entire session on your phone. We need video evidence of her refusing help, preferably with some kind of emotional outburst that demonstrates instability. What if she doesn't refuse? Madison asked. What if she agrees to get help? She will refuse, the thin man said confidently. Based on Dr. Hayes's assessment, she exhibits classic patterns of paranoid thinking and oppositional behavior. When confronted with multiple family members and a professional interventionist, she'll perceive it as an attack and react defensively. That defensive reaction will be interpreted as further evidence of her compromised mental state. They were so confident in their manipulation, so certain they could predict and control my responses. They'd been studying me like a lab specimen, learning my patterns and triggers so they could orchestrate the exact scenario they needed to justify their actions. Remember, the woman emphasized, once the proceedings begin, there's no going back. Alexandra will be taken into custody immediately following Dr. Hayes's evaluation. She won't have the opportunity to contact friends, liquidate assets, or interfere with the trust administration. This has to be handled cleanly and completely. After another 30 minutes of detailed planning, the meeting broke up. I slipped back outside through the garage and sat in my car for 20 minutes, waiting for the strangers to leave. When I finally went inside, my family was cleaning up the dining room, putting away papers and wiping down surfaces as if the meeting had never happened. How was therapy? My mother asked brightly. Really helpful, I said, matching her cheerful tone. Dr. Martinez thinks I'm making great progress. That's wonderful, sweetheart, she said, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. Inni. 4 days, they planned to spring their intervention. In 4 days, they expected to have me committed against my will, but I had 4 days to disappear first. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my desk and created a detailed plan for what I was now thinking of as my extraction. I had enough money saved to survive for several months. I had copies of all their documentation stored securely in the cloud. I had Dr. Martinez's professional assessment of my mental health, and now I had recorded evidence of their conspiracy. Using my phone, I'd managed to capture the last 15 minutes of their meeting, including the discussion about the intervention timeline and their plan to use my inheritance money. The audio quality wasn't perfect, but it was clear enough to understand their intentions. The next morning, I called in sick to work, claiming a minor stomach bug that would keep me home for the rest of the week. Then I began executing my plan. First, I drove to Dr. Martinez's office for an emergency session. I played her the audio recording and showed her all the documentation I'd gathered. She listened with growing concern, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. Alexandra, she said when I finished, this is a clear case of psychological and financial abuse. What they're planning isn't just unethical, it's potentially criminal. We need to report this to the authorities. I want to, I said, but I need to get myself to safety first. If I file a report now, they'll accelerate their timeline. They might try to have me committed before the investigation can begin. She nodded slowly. What do you need from me? A comprehensive psychological evaluation, I said. Something official that clearly states my mental health status and capacity to make my own decisions. And I need it today. Dr. Martinez cleared her schedule and spent the next 3 hours conducting the most thorough psychological assessment I'd ever experienced. Cognitive testing, emotional evaluation, detailed interviews about my family relationships and recent experiences. When she was finished, she wrote a comprehensive report that painted a picture of someone who was not only mentally stable, but who was showing remarkable resilience in the face of systematic manipulation and abuse. This report clearly establishes your competency, she told me as she handed me the sealed document. Anyone who tries to claim you're mentally unfit will have to explain why their assessment differs so dramatically from mine. Next, I went to the bank and withdrew enough cash to cover my immediate needs. I couldn't clean out my accounts without triggering alerts. but I could take enough to survive for several weeks. I also obtained a cashier's check for a larger amount, something I could deposit in my new account once I was safely in Denver. Then I went home and began the careful process of packing. Not everything, just the essentials I would need to restart. My life, clothes, documents, laptop, a few sentimental items that I couldn't bear to leave behind. Everything fit into 2 suitcases and a backpack, items I could travel with easily. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal for the next 3 days. Sitting through family dinners, listening to Madison's live streams, participating in casual conversations while knowing exactly what they were planning. Every time my mother asked how I was feeling, every time my father suggested I might want to skip work and rest, every time Madison casually mentioned how much she loved and supported me, I had to bite back the truth that was burning in my throat. On Monday night, 24 hours before their planned intervention, I made my final preparations. I transferred the last of my available funds to my new account. I wrote a letter to my employer explaining that I was taking emergency leave due to family circumstances and would be in touch about my future employment status. I packed my car with my suitcases, hiding them in the garage where my family wouldn't see them. And then I wrote 3 letters. The first was to Dr. Martinez, thanking her for her help and providing her with contact information for my new location. I authorized her to share my psychological evaluation with any legal or medical professionals who might need to verify my mental health status. The second was to my lawyer, a woman named Catherine Walsh, whom I'd quietly consulted the week before. I'd already paid her a retainer and briefed her on my situation. This letter provided her with additional documentation and authorized her to act on my behalf in any legal proceedings that might arise from my disappearance. The third letter was for my family. It was the hardest one to write, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I had to find a way to say it that couldn't be used against me later. I couldn't sound angry or unstable. I couldn't give them any ammunition for their narrative about my compromised mental health. Instead, I had to sound calm, rational, and completely in control of my faculties. Dear Mom, Dad, and Madison, I wrote, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I know about your plans for Tuesday's intervention. I know about Dr. Hayes and the involuntary commitment proceedings. I know about the lawyers you've consulted and the strategy you've developed to access my inheritance. I have documented evidence of all of it, including audio recordings of your planning meetings. I have also obtained an independent psychological evaluation that confirms my mental health and competency. I am not mentally ill, and I will not be manipulated into residential treatment I don't need. I am 24 years old, financially independent, and legally entitled to make my own decisions about my life and my health care. Your attempts to have me declared mentally unfit constitute abuse, and your plans to access my inheritance through fraudulent means constitute financial exploitation. I have consulted with legal counsel and will be pursuing appropriate remedies for your actions. Do not attempt to contact me or locate me. Any efforts to involve law enforcement in finding me will result in the immediate release of all recorded evidence to relevant authorities. I hope that someday you will understand that what you planned to do was wrong, and that families are supposed to protect each other, not exploit each other for financial gain. Alexandra. I sealed the letter in an envelope and left it on my pillow where they would find it Tuesday morning, after I was already hundreds of miles away. My bus to Denver left at 6 a.m. Tuesday morning. I was at the station by 5:30, watching the sunrise over the desert landscape I was leaving behind. As the bus pulled away from Phoenix, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: relief. For the first time in almost a year, I was safe. No one was monitoring my behavior, documenting my moods, or planning my future without my consent. No one was building a case against my sanity or scheming to steal my inheritance. The 18-hour bus ride to Denver gave me time to process everything that had happened and plan for what came next. I wasn't just running away from my family's manipulation. I was running toward a life where I could be myself without fear, where my normal human emotions and responses wouldn't be pathologized, where my trust fund would actually be used for my benefit instead of their enrichment. I had Dr. Martinez's psychological evaluation, proving my mental competency. I had audio recordings of their conspiracy, proving their intent to commit fraud. I had my grandmother's trust documents, proving my legal right to the inheritance they were trying to steal. And I had the beginning of a new life in a city where they couldn't find me, couldn't manipulate me, and couldn't control me. They thought they were playing a game they couldn't lose. But they'd forgotten one crucial thing. I was my grandmother's granddaughter, and she'd raised me to be smarter and stronger than they'd ever given me credit for. When my bus pulled into Denver's Union Station that evening, I didn't look back. I was done being their victim. Now I was going to show them what happened when you underestimated someone who'd been quietly learning to fight back. Denver's morning air hit my lungs like freedom itself. I'd spent my first night in a modest hotel, near the train station, paying cash and using a fake name I'd practiced saying until it felt natural. The city stretched out before me in the early dawn light, all snow-capped mountains and urban possibilities, completely different from the endless desert sprawl I'd left behind. My phone had been buzzing constantly since yesterday afternoon. 17 missed calls from my mother, 12 from my father, and 43 text messages that I hadn't opened. I'd turned off all location services and switched the device to airplane mode, but I could still see the notification count climbing. Every time I briefly turned it back on to check the time. They'd found my letter. They knew I was gone. And based on the frequency of their attempts to contact me, they were panicking. Good. My first priority was finding somewhere to live that wouldn't require a credit check that could trace back to my family. I'd researched Denver's rental market extensively during my planning phase, focusing on neighborhoods with short-term rental options and landlords who were willing to work with cash payments. Highland turned out to be perfect. It was a gentrifying area with a mix of young professionals and longtime residents, full of small apartment buildings and converted houses that offered month-to-month leases. I found a furnished studio in a brick building that had clearly seen better days, but it was clean, secure, and most importantly, available immediately. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, was a practical woman in her 60s who asked few questions when I explained that I was relocating for work and needed something temporary while I looked for a permanent place. I paid her 3 months' rent in advance, cash, along with a security deposit that made her eyes light up with the kind of satisfaction that comes from dealing with a tenant who won't be late on payments. Utilities included, laundry in the basement, parking space in the back, she told me as she handed over 2 keys. Quiet building, mostly working people, no parties, no pets, no drama. No drama sounds perfect, I said, and meant it more than she could possibly know. The studio was small but functional, with tall windows that let in plenty of light, and a tiny kitchen that would suit my simple cooking needs. Most importantly, it had strong locks and a view of the street that would let me see anyone approaching the building. After months of feeling watched and monitored, the privacy felt like luxury. I spent my first full day in Denver setting up the practical aspects of my new life. I opened a local bank account using my new address and deposited the cashier's check I'd brought from Phoenix. I found a nearby grocery store and stocked my tiny kitchen with basics. I located the closest library, coffee shops with reliable Wi-Fi, and transit routes that would give me mobility without needing to rely on ride shares that could potentially track my location. But the most important thing I did that day was contact Catherine Walsh, my lawyer back in Phoenix. "Alexandra," she said when I called from a payphone outside a downtown restaurant. "I've been expecting to hear from you. Your family has been calling my office since yesterday afternoon." "What are they saying?" "They're claiming you've had some kind of mental health crisis and disappeared. They want to know if I've heard from you, and they're asking about procedures for filing a missing person report." I laughed, a sound with no humor in it. A missing person report, for someone who left a detailed letter explaining exactly why she was leaving. They're also asking about the trust fund, Catherine continued. They want to know what legal options they have for accessing the money to pay for your treatment, given your current mental state. My current mental state is excellent, I said firmly. I have a professional psychological evaluation to prove it. Are they moving forward with their original plan? It appears so. Dr. Hayes filed a preliminary assessment yesterday stating that you pose a danger to yourself due to paranoid ideation and poor judgment. He's recommending immediate psychiatric evaluation and possible involuntary commitment. Based on what evidence? They never got their intervention. I wasn't there. To refuse treatment. That's where it gets interesting, Catherine said, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. According to the filing, your disappearance itself is being presented as evidence of your compromised mental state. They're arguing that only someone experiencing a psychological crisis would abandon their family and support system without warning. The audacity was breathtaking. They were using my escape from their manipulation as proof that I needed to be manipulated. Can they actually get a commitment order based on that? Not easily, Catherine assured me. Especially not with Dr. Martinez's evaluation contradicting their claims. But they can certainly make things difficult. The good news is that you're now in a different state, which complicates their legal options significantly. What do you need from me? Everything. You have. All the documentation, the recordings, Dr. Martinez's evaluation. I want to file a formal complaint with the state bar about Dr. Hayes' conduct, and I think we have grounds for a civil suit against your family for attempted fraud and financial abuse. I want to wait on the civil suit, I said after a moment of consideration. But definitely proceed with the complaint against Dr. Hayes. And I want to file for a restraining order that prevents them from accessing any information about my whereabouts or financial status. Consider it done. How are you holding up? The question caught me off guard. For weeks, I'd been so focused on survival and escape that I hadn't really processed the emotional impact of what I'd been through. Now, standing on a street corner, in a city where no one was monitoring my behavior or questioning my sanity, I felt the full weight of what my family had tried to do to me. I'm angry, I said honestly. But I'm also relieved. For the first time in months, I feel like myself again. That's a normal response to what you've been through, Catherine said gently. What they did to you was psychological abuse, Alexandra. The fact that you recognized it and protected yourself shows remarkable strength. After I hung up with Catherine, I walked back to my apartment and finally allowed myself to process the messages my family had been sending. I turned on my phone and read through them systematically, screenshot each one, then turned the device off again. The messages followed a predictable pattern. First, confusion and concern. Where are you? We're worried sick. Then escalation and manipulation. This is exactly the kind of behavior we were worried about. You're proving that you need help. Then guilt and emotional blackmail. You're destroying this family. Madison is heartbroken. How could you be so selfish? And finally, threats, disguised as consequences. If you don't come home immediately, we'll have no choice but to involve the authorities. What struck me most was how quickly they'd abandoned any pretense of caring about my well-being. Within hours of discovering my departure, their messages had shifted from worried family members to people whose primary concern was maintaining control. They weren't asking if I was safe or if I needed anything. They were demanding that I return, so they could proceed with their plan. The most revealing message came from Madison. I can't believe you would sabotage my content and my brand like this. Do you have any idea how this makes our family look? I'm going to have to completely restructure my wellness platform because of your selfishness. Even in crisis, Madison's primary concern was her social media presence. The fact that her sister had fled the state was less important than how it might affect her follower engagement. That evening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. I created my own social media account, something I'd never done independently. Not to build a brand or seek attention, but to establish a public record of my mental competency and voluntary relocation. The username was simple: Real Alex Thompson. The bio read, 24, independent, starting fresh in Colorado, mental health advocate and trust fund beneficiary speaking truth about family manipulation. My first post was a photo of the Denver skyline, with a caption that laid out the basic facts. When your family tries to have you involuntarily committed to steal your inheritance, sometimes the healthiest choice is to leave. Currently safe, employed, and working with legal counsel to address attempted financial fraud. To anyone going through similar manipulation, trust your instincts, document everything, and remember that choosing your own welfare over others' control isn't selfish. I tagged it with hashtags related to family abuse, financial exploitation, and mental health advocacy. Within hours, the post had dozens of comments from people sharing similar experiences, offering support, and asking for resources. But more importantly, it established a public timeline of my voluntary relocation and mental competency. Anyone investigating my disappearance would see clear evidence that I'd left of my own free will, in full possession of my faculties, with legitimate concerns about my family's behavior. The response was overwhelming in the best possible way. Messages from other young adults who'd experienced family manipulation, from people who'd dealt with false mental health claims, from inheritance beneficiaries whose families had tried similar schemes. I wasn't alone in this experience, and my decision to speak publicly was giving others permission to recognize and name their own situations. One message particularly stood out, from someone named Rachel Kim. I saw your post about family manipulation and inheritance theft. I used to work at a trust administration company in Phoenix. Would you be interested in talking? I might have information that could help your case. I messaged her back immediately, and we arranged to speak by phone the next day. Rachel turned out to be a former employee of the company that managed my grandmother's trust. She'd left the job 6 months earlier, after becoming uncomfortable with some of the practices she'd observed. Your family has been asking a lot of questions about the trust, she told me during our call, way more than typical trustees usually ask. They wanted to know about loopholes, about what kinds of expenses they could justify, about the process for accessing funds for extended medical treatment. When did these conversations start? About 8 months ago, right around the time they first contacted Dr. Hayes, according to the invoices I processed. They've been planning this for 8 months? At least. But here's the thing that really bothered me. They weren't asking these questions because they were worried about you. They were asking them like they were shopping for options, like they were trying to figure out the most lucrative way to handle your trust. Rachel had kept copies of several emails and invoices related to my trust, all of which painted a picture of a family systematically researching how to exploit a legal loophole for financial gain. She was willing to provide this information to my lawyer, and she'd already filed a complaint with her former employer about the suspicious nature of my family's inquiries. There's something else, she said near the end of our conversation. Your trust isn't the only one they've been asking about. They mentioned a cousin of yours, someone named James Thompson, who has a similar trust structure. They wanted to know if the same strategies would work for other family members. My blood ran cold. James was my cousin on my father's side, a Tio, quiet guy about my age who'd always been overshadowed by more outgoing family members. He'd inherited money from the same grandmother, with the same trust structure, the same 25th birthday milestone. Is James in danger? I asked. I don't know, Rachel said. But based on the questions your family was asking, I'd say yes. They were definitely gathering information that could be applied to his situation. After we hung up, I sat in my small apartment staring out at the Denver evening and processing this new information. My family hadn't just targeted me. They'd developed a systematic approach to exploiting family trusts, and I might not be their only intended victim. I had to warn James. Finding his contact information took some detective work, since I didn't want to use my usual social media accounts where my family might see my activity. But I eventually located him through his university's directory. He was a graduate student at UC Berkeley, studying environmental engineering. Our conversation was awkward at first. We'd never been particularly close, and calling out of the blue to warn him about family manipulation wasn't exactly a normal cousin chat. But once I explained what I'd discovered, he became very quiet. "Alex," he said finally, "they've been talking to me too. About mental health concerns, about how stressful graduate school can be, about how important it is to have family support during difficult times. Have they suggested therapy or treatment?" "Actually, yes. My Aunt Patricia called last week and said she'd found a really good psychiatrist who specializes in helping young adults handle academic pressure. She wanted to set up a consultation for me. James, don't go to that appointment. That's Dr. Hayes, and he's not legitimate. He's the one who's been helping them build false mental health cases." I spent the next hour walking James through everything I'd discovered, sharing the evidence I'd gathered, and connecting him with Catherine Walsh for legal protection. By the end of our conversation, he was as shocked and angry as I'd been. "I can't believe they would do this," he said. "I mean, I always knew they were kind of self-centered, but this is criminal." "It is literally criminal," I confirmed. "And now they know I'm onto them, so they might accelerate their timeline with you." "What should I do?" "Document everything. Get an independent psychological evaluation. Consider whether you want to relocate temporarily until you turn 25 and gain full control of your trust. And most importantly, don't trust them with any information about your mental health, your finances, or your plans." James decided to take a leave of absence from school and stay with friends in San Francisco until his birthday in March. Like me, he would disappear from their reach until he could legally protect himself. That night, I realized that my escape had become something bigger than just protecting myself. By speaking out, by documenting their behavior, by connecting with other victims, I was building a case that could prevent them from victimizing anyone else. My phone had stopped buzzing with their messages, but not because they'd given up. Catherine had sent them a formal cease and desist letter demanding that they stop attempting to contact me, and she'd filed for the restraining order that would legally prevent them from accessing information about my location or financial status. More importantly, the complaint against Dr. Hayes was already having an impact. The state medical board had opened an investigation into his practices, particularly his willingness to provide psychiatric assessments of patients he'd never actually examined. Several other families had come forward with similar complaints, suggesting that my family's scheme wasn't unique. I was sitting in a coffee shop in Highland, working on my laptop and planning my next moves, when an email arrived that changed everything. It was from someone named Detective Maria Santos with the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. "Ms. Thompson," it read, "we are investigating allegations of financial fraud and elder abuse related to trust fund manipulation. Your attorney, Catherine Walsh, has provided us with evidence that you may be a victim of these crimes. We would like to speak with you about your experiences. You are not in any legal trouble, and this contact is purely for investigative purposes. Please call at your earliest convenience." Financial Crimes Unit, Elder Abuse. The investigation had expanded beyond just my situation. I called Detective Santos immediately, and what she told me confirmed my worst fears and my greatest hopes. "Ms. Thompson, your family's activities have come to our attention through multiple channels. We've received complaints from the state medical board about Dr. Hayes, reports from the trust administration company about suspicious inquiries, and testimony from other potential victims. What started as a single case has revealed what appears to be a pattern of financial exploitation targeting young trust fund beneficiaries. How many other victims are there? We're still investigating, but so far we've identified at least 5 families who used similar tactics with Dr. Hayes' assistance. The scheme involves falsely diagnosing young adults with mental health conditions gaining access to their trust funds for unnecessary treatment, and keeping them in residential facilities long enough to maintain control past their legal majority. So this was never just about me. No, ma'am. Your family appears to have been part of a larger network engaging in systematic financial fraud. Dr. Hayes has been providing false psychiatric evaluations for families across multiple states, always with the same pattern: young adults with substantial inheritances, claims of mental health crises, recommendations for long-term residential treatment. The scope of it was staggering. My family hadn't just tried to steal my inheritance. They'd been part of a criminal conspiracy that had targeted dozens of young people, destroying lives and families for profit. What happens now? I asked. We'll need your full cooperation as a witness. All the documentation you've gathered, your recordings of their planning meetings, testimony about their behavior and timeline. In exchange, we can offer you protection from any further attempts to have you committed or to access your trust funds. And my family? They'll be arrested and charged with multiple felonies: conspiracy to commit fraud, financial elder abuse, filing false medical reports, and several other crimes. This is a serious case, Ms. Thompson. People are going to prison. That evening, I sat in my small Denver apartment and tried to process everything that had happened. 3 weeks ago, I'd been a daughter who thought her family was just a little dysfunctional. Now I was a key witness in a federal financial crimes investigation. But more than that, I was free. Free from their manipulation, free from their control, free from the constant fear that my normal human emotions and responses were being cataloged as symptoms of mental illness. My phone buzzed with a new message, but this time it wasn't from my family. It was from someone named Michelle, who'd seen my social media post about trust fund manipulation. "Thank you for speaking out," she wrote. "My family tried the same thing last year. Because of your post, I realized I wasn't crazy and I wasn't alone. I've contacted a lawyer and I'm finally ready to fight back." That's when I understood that my escape had become something much more important than just saving myself. By running away from their manipulation, by refusing to be their victim, by speaking the truth publicly, I'd accidentally become exactly what I'd needed when I was trapped: proof that escape was possible, that resistance was worthwhile, that the people trying to convince you that you're crazy might be the ones with the real problems. I was no longer just Alexandra Thompson, the daughter who'd disappointed her family. I was Alexandra Thompson, the woman who'd recognized abuse and chosen freedom, the woman who'd gathered evidence and built a case, the woman who'd turned her family's attempt to silence her into a platform for speaking truth. And I was just getting started. The federal courthouse in Denver was imposing in a way that made my hands shake as I climbed the granite steps. It had been 6 weeks since I'd fled Phoenix, and today I was giving my formal deposition in what had become known as the Hayes Trust Fund scandal. The media had picked up the story after 3 more families came forward with similar experiences. And suddenly, my private nightmare had become a national conversation about elder abuse and financial exploitation. Detective Santos met me at the security checkpoint, her calm presence helping to steady my nerves. She'd become something of a mentor over the past month, walking me through the legal process and helping me understand my role in bringing down what prosecutors were calling one of the largest inheritance fraud schemes in recent history. "Remember," she said as we rode the elevator to the 15th floor, "you're not on trial here. You're helping us build a case against people who victimized you and dozens of others. Tell the truth, stick to the facts, and don't let their lawyers intimidate you." The deposition room was smaller than I'd expected, filled with stern-faced people in expensive suits. My family's legal team had hired what Detective Santos described as the best defense money could buy, while the prosecution was being handled by federal attorneys who specialized in financial crimes. I was accompanied by Catherine Walsh, who'd flown in from Phoenix specifically for this proceeding. Across the table sat my parents and Madison, looking older and smaller than I remembered. My mother's perfectly styled hair showed gray roots she'd never allowed to be visible before. My father's confident posture had been replaced by a nervous fidgeting that made him appear fragile. Madison looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, her usual social media glow replaced by dark circles and pale skin. They wouldn't meet my eyes. "Ms. Thompson," the prosecutor began, "please state your relationship to the defendants." "Patricia and David Thompson are my parents. Madison Thompson is my sister." The words felt strange in my mouth, clinical and distant. "Can you describe the events that led to your departure from the family home in Phoenix?" For the next 4 hours, I walked through everything. The gradual escalation of their manipulation, the discovery of their documentation, the recording of their planning meeting, the network of professionals they'd assembled to support their false narrative. I presented emails, photographs, audio recordings, and financial documents that painted a clear picture of premeditated fraud. The defense attorneys tried to discredit my testimony, suggesting that my interpretation of events was colored by paranoia and mental instability. But Dr. Martinez's psychological evaluation, combined with the evaluations from 2 additional independent psychologists, made it impossible for them to maintain that narrative. "Ms. Thompson," Madison's lawyer said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that you've struggled with feelings of jealousy toward your sister's success?" "No," I replied calmly. I was proud of Madison's accomplishments. What I struggled with was being systematically excluded from my own family and having my normal emotional responses pathologized for financial gain. "But you admit that you experienced anger and resentment toward your family members?" "I experienced appropriate emotional responses to being manipulated and abused. If someone discovers that their family is planning to have them falsely committed to steal their inheritance, anger is a normal and healthy reaction." The lawyer tried several more approaches, attempting to paint me as unstable, vindictive, or motivated by greed. But each line of questioning only served to highlight the extensive evidence I'd gathered and the systematic nature of my family's scheme. During a break, I saw Madison approach the women's restroom at the same time I did. For a moment, we stood facing each other in the hallway, the first time we'd been alone since I'd discovered their plan. "Alex," she said softly, "this has gotten so out of hand. Can't we just fix this privately, as a family?" I studied her face, looking for any sign of genuine remorse or understanding. What I saw instead was calculation, even now. She wasn't sorry for what they'd planned to do to me. She was sorry they'd been caught. "Madison," I said quietly, "you participated in a plan to have me falsely committed to a psychiatric facility so you could steal my inheritance. You documented my behavior like I was a specimen in a lab. You built a timeline for destroying my life. There's no fixing that privately." "But the publicity is ruining everything," she said. And there it was. Her real concern wasn't my welfare or our family relationships. It was her brand, her image, her social media empire that was crumbling under the weight of negative attention. "The publicity is telling the truth," I replied. "Maybe if you'd been more concerned with my actual well-being and less concerned with your content calendar, we wouldn't be here." She looked genuinely shocked, as if the idea that her actions might have real consequences had never occurred to her. "But you're my sister," she said weakly. "Yes," I agreed. "I was your sister, and you tried to have me imprisoned for money." When we returned to the deposition room, the prosecutor introduced new evidence that changed the entire scope of the case. Financial records showed that my family had received payments from Dr. Hayes's operation, essentially being paid to provide victims for his fraudulent scheme. They weren't just trying to steal my inheritance. They were being compensated for delivering young trust fund beneficiaries to a criminal network. "Ms. Thompson," the prosecutor asked, "were you aware that your family received monetary compensation for their participation in this scheme?" The revelation hit me like a physical blow. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I thought they were just trying to access my trust fund. I didn't know they were being paid to victimize me. The financial records were devastating. Over the course of 8 months, my family had received over $50,000 in what were labeled as consultation fees and referral bonuses. They'd literally been paid to build a case against my mental health, to document my behavior, to deliver me to Dr. Hayes for false diagnosis. My parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the prosecutor walked through each payment, each invoice, each piece of evidence that showed their systematic betrayal of their own daughter for profit. But the most damning evidence came from Madison's own social media accounts. The prosecution had obtained deleted posts and private messages that revealed the extent of her involvement in building the false narrative about my mental health. "Look at this post from 6 months ago," the prosecutor said, displaying a screenshot on the courtroom monitor. Ms. Madison Thompson wrote, "Dealing with family mental health challenges. Sometimes the people you love most need help they won't accept. Grateful for professional guidance on how to stage an intervention." This was posted 2 months before any alleged mental health crisis on your part, wasn't it, Ms. Thompson? "Yes," I confirmed, reading my sister's words with growing horror. She'd been using my situation as content for her wellness brand, painting herself as the long-suffering sister dealing with a mentally ill sibling, all while knowing that the mental illness was fabricated. The prosecutor continued displaying evidence from Madison's accounts. Messages to other influencers asking for advice on how to handle family drama while protecting your brand. Conversations with sponsors about potentially monetizing a mental health awareness campaign based on our family's experiences. Draft posts about supporting a sister through psychiatric treatment that had been written before any treatment had been recommended. She'd been planning to profit from my false imprisonment, to build her personal brand around the narrative of being a supportive sister to someone who was mentally ill. The psychiatric facility wasn't just about accessing my trust fund, it was about providing her with authentic content for her wellness empire. Ms. Thompson, Madison's lawyer, tried to redirect. These social media posts could be interpreted as someone genuinely trying to help a family member. They could be, I agreed, if there was actually a family member who needed help. But since I was never mentally ill, and since she knew the mental health crisis was fabricated, these posts show someone planning to exploit a false narrative for personal gain. The deposition continued for 2 more hours, covering every aspect of their scheme. By the end, even my family's expensive lawyers looked defeated. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern was clear, and the financial motivation was undeniable. As we prepared to leave the courthouse, Detective Santos pulled me aside. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "Dr. Hayes has agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence. He's providing information about all the families involved in this scheme, including details about how your family was recruited and trained." "What kind of details?" Apparently, this operation had been running for over 3 years. Families were specifically targeted based on their trust fund structures and family dynamics. Your family wasn't random victims who got in over their heads. They were recruited because someone identified you as an ideal target. The idea that I'd been selected, studied, and targeted by strangers was somehow even more violating than discovering my family's betrayal. I'd been reduced to a case study, a profitable opportunity, a problem to be solved for someone else's financial gain. Who recruited them? We're still investigating, but it appears to be a network of financial advisors, trust administrators, and medical professionals who specialized in identifying vulnerable beneficiaries. They had a whole system for evaluating potential targets and matching them with compliant families. That evening, I sat in my Denver apartment processing everything I'd learned. My family hadn't just betrayed me on impulse or out of desperation. They'd been recruited, trained, and compensated to systematically destroy my life. The people who were supposed to love and protect me had been turned into weapons against me by strangers who saw my inheritance as a business opportunity. But something else had become clear during the deposition. I wasn't just a victim anymore. Over the past 6 weeks, I'd become something much more powerful: a credible witness with documented evidence, an articulate spokesperson for other victims, and a catalyst for systemic change. The media attention had been overwhelming at first, but I'd learned to use it strategically. Instead of hiding from reporters, I'd started giving carefully planned interviews that focused on the broader issues of financial elder abuse and trust, fund exploitation. Instead of avoiding social media, I'd built a platform that connected victims and provided resources for people in similar situations. My following had grown to over 100,000 people, not because I was seeking fame, but because I was speaking truth about experiences that many people recognized but had never been able to name. Young adults whose families controlled their finances inappropriately, trust fund beneficiaries who'd experienced manipulation around their inheritances, people who'd been gaslit about their mental health by family members with ulterior motives. The most rewarding messages came from people who'd used my story as a blueprint for recognizing and escaping their own situations. A college student in Texas whose family had been pressuring her to sign over control of her inheritance. A young man in Florida whose relatives had been trying to have him declared incompetent after a minor car accident. A woman in Oregon whose in-laws had been systematically undermining her relationship with her husband to gain access to her family trust. Each success story felt like vindication, proof that speaking out had been worth the personal cost. 3 days after the deposition, Catherine Walsh called with news that would change everything again. "Alexandra," she said, "the prosecution wants to offer your family a plea deal." "What kind of plea deal?" "They would plead guilty to conspiracy and financial fraud charges, serve reduced sentences, and pay full restitution to all victims. In exchange, they would provide testimony against the other professionals involved in the network." I was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. "What kind of reduced sentences?" "Probably 2 to 3 years each, plus probation and community service. Without the plea deal, they're looking at potentially 10 to 15 years each." "And they would testify against Dr. Hayes and the others?" "Yes. They'd have to provide complete information about how the scheme worked, who recruited them, how they were trained, everything. It would help the prosecution take down the entire network." The decision wasn't as simple as it might have seemed. Part of me wanted my family to face the full consequences of their actions, to serve the maximum sentence possible for what they'd tried to do to me. But another part of me recognized that their testimony could prevent this from happening. To other families, other young adults who might not be as prepared or as lucky as I'd been, what happens to my inheritance if they take the plea? "You get it all back, plus interest and damages. The trust would be transferred to your direct control immediately, regardless of your age. You'd also be entitled to compensation for the emotional distress and other damages you've suffered." "How much money are we talking about?" "Your grandmother's trust was worth about $2 million. With interest and the additional damages, you're looking at close to $3 million. Plus, there will likely be a civil settlement with Dr. Hayes and the other professionals involved. $3 million. Enough to never have to worry about money again, enough to start any kind of life I wanted, enough to fund the kind of advocacy work I'd accidentally fallen into." "I need time to think about it," I said. "Of course. But Alexandra, there's one more thing. The prosecution believes your testimony and your family's cooperation could help them build cases in other states. This network was operating nationally, and there could be dozens more victims who don't even know they were targeted." That night, I called Dr. Martinez for guidance. Over the past month, she'd continued to provide support as I navigated the legal process and the media attention. "How do you feel about the idea of your family receiving reduced sentences?" she asked. "Honestly, I feel conflicted. Part of me wants them to pay the full price for what they did. but part of me just wants this to be over so I can move on with my life. Those are both normal reactions. What matters is what feels right to you, not what other people think you should want. I keep thinking about all the other victims, the ones who might not have been as lucky as I was. If my family's testimony can prevent this from happening to someone else, maybe that's more important than my desire for revenge. It sounds like you're already leaning toward a decision. I think I am, but I want to set some conditions. The next morning, I called Catherine back with my answer. I'll support the plea deal, I said, but I want specific conditions. First, they have to provide complete and truthful testimony, not just about their own actions, but about how they were recruited and trained. Second, they have to participate in educational programs that help other families recognize and prevent this kind of exploitation. Third, they have to issue a public apology that acknowledges the harm they caused and takes full responsibility for their actions. Those are reasonable conditions. I think the prosecution will agree to them. And one more thing. I want to be allowed to speak at their sentencing hearing. I want them to hear, directly from me, how their actions affected my life. That can definitely be arranged. The plea negotiations took another 2 weeks, but eventually all parties reached an agreement. My family would plead guilty to federal conspiracy and fraud charges, serve 30 months in prison, pay full restitution, and provide complete cooperation with the ongoing investigation. More importantly for me, their testimony led to indictments against 12 other professionals involved in the scheme, including trust administrators who'd identified vulnerable beneficiaries, financial advisors who'd helped families access trust funds inappropriately, and medical professionals who'd provided false diagnoses. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a cold Thursday morning in February. I'd been preparing my victim impact statement for weeks, trying to find words that would capture not just what they'd done to me, but what they'd tried to steal from me beyond money. Standing at the podium in the federal courthouse, looking directly at my family for the first time since the deposition, I felt a strange sense of closure beginning. Your Honor, I began, the defendants planned to have me falsely imprisoned in a psychiatric facility so they could steal my inheritance. But what they really tried to steal was much more valuable than money. They tried to steal my sense of reality, my trust in my own perceptions, my belief that I deserved love and protection from the people who were supposed to care for me most. I went on to describe the systematic nature of their manipulation, the way they'd documented my normal behaviors as symptoms of mental illness, the network of professionals they'd assembled to support their false narrative. But they failed, I concluded. They failed because I trusted myself more than I trusted their version of me. They failed because I gathered evidence and built my own case. They failed because I chose my own welfare over their comfort. And they failed because other people recognized the truth and chose to help me rather than enabling my abusers. When I finished speaking, I looked directly at each of them. My mother was crying quietly. My father stared at his hands. Madison met my eyes for just a moment, and I saw something there that might have been genuine remorse. The judge sentenced them each to 30 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. They would begin serving their sentences immediately. As they were led away in handcuffs, I felt something I hadn't expected. Peace. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but a kind of resolution that came from knowing that justice had been served, and that their ability to harm me or anyone else had been permanently limited. Outside the courthouse, Detective Santos approached me one final time. "Miss Thompson," she said, "I want you to know that your courage in coming forward has made a real difference. Because of your testimony, we've been able to dismantle an entire criminal network. Dozens of families will never experience what you went through. What happens now?" "Now you get to live your life," she said with a smile. "You get to decide who you want to be, where you want to go, what you want to do with your freedom and your resources. You've earned that right." That evening, I sat in my Denver apartment with a bottle of champagne Catherine had sent to celebrate the conclusion of the case. Tomorrow, I would officially gain control of my inheritance. I would have the financial freedom to go anywhere, do anything, become anyone I wanted to be. But more than that, I had something even more valuable. Proof that I could trust myself, evidence that I could survive betrayal and manipulation, and the knowledge that I could turn my worst experience into something that helped other people. I was no longer Alexandra Thompson, the daughter whose family tried to destroy her. I was Alexandra Thompson, the woman who'd fought back and won. The woman who'd turned their attempt to silence her into a platform for change. The woman who'd transformed their betrayal into other people's liberation. And I was ready to build, whatever came next. 2 years later, I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office in downtown Denver, watching the morning sun paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and pink. The nameplate on my door read, Alexandra Thompson, founder and executive director, Trust Truth Foundation. And every morning when I saw it, I felt a quiet satisfaction that still surprised me. The foundation had grown beyond anything I'd imagined. When I'd first started using my social media platform to help other victims of family financial abuse, what had begun as a way to connect with people who shared similar experiences had evolved into a comprehensive resource center that provided legal assistance, psychological support, and advocacy for young adults facing exploitation by their own families. My assistant knocked on the doorframe, holding a steaming cup of coffee and a folder filled with the day's schedule. "Your 9 o'clock is here," she said. "The interview with Forbes about the new legislation." The Inheritance Protection Act had passed both houses of Congress the previous month, establishing new safeguards for trust fund beneficiaries and requiring additional oversight for psychiatric evaluations related to financial decisions. It was legislation I'd spent the past year lobbying for, working with other advocates and legal experts to craft policies that would prevent what had happened to me from happening to others. The Forbes reporter was a sharp woman in her 40s, who'd been following the trust fund abuse story since the initial criminal cases had broken. We settled into the comfortable chairs arranged around a low table in my office, surrounded by the awards and recognitions that now decorated my walls. The Victim Advocacy Award from the National Center for Elder Justice, the Young Leader Recognition from the American Bar Association, the Community Impact Certificate from the Colorado Legislature. "Ms. Thompson," she began, "2 years ago you were a victim of family financial abuse. Now you're leading a national movement for inheritance protection reform. How did that transformation happen?" I considered the question, thinking about the winding path that had brought me to this moment. "I think it started with a choice," I said finally. "When I discovered what my family was planning, I had to decide whether to be paralyzed by their betrayal or to trust my own judgment about what was happening. That first choice to trust myself led to every choice that followed. But the foundation, the advocacy work, the legislative efforts, that's much more than just trusting yourself. That's building something entirely new. I realized early on that my experience wasn't unique. I was getting messages from hundreds of people who'd faced similar manipulation from their families. People who'd been gaslit about their mental health, whose inheritances had been exploited, who'd been isolated and controlled by the people who were supposed to protect them. There was a whole population of victims who didn't have resources or support systems to fight back. The reporter made notes as I spoke, occasionally asking follow-up questions about specific programs the foundation offered. We'd developed a legal aid clinic that provided free consultation for young adults facing family financial manipulation. We'd created support groups for people recovering from family psychological abuse. We'd established an emergency fund that helped victims relocate safely when they needed to escape controlling family situations. "The numbers are staggering," I continued. "Our research suggests that family financial abuse affects over 200,000 young adults annually. But it's drastically underreported because victims often don't recognize what's happening to them as abuse. When it's your own family gaslighting you about your mental health or manipulating your finances, it's incredibly difficult to see the situation clearly. What's been the most rewarding aspect of this work? Without hesitation, I reached for a letter from the stack on my desk. I get messages like this one every week, I said, holding up the handwritten note. This is from a 23-year-old woman in Michigan whose aunt was trying to gain control of her inheritance by having her declared incompetent after a minor head injury. She used our legal resources to challenge the proceedings, and she won. She kept her inheritance and her autonomy because she had access to information and support that I didn't have when I was in crisis. The interview continued for another hour, covering the Foundation's expansion plans, the impact of the new legislation, and my personal journey from victim to advocate. When the reporter left, I had a few minutes to review my afternoon schedule before my next appointment arrived. At 11, I was meeting with Dr. Martinez, who'd become not just my former therapist but a colleague and friend. She'd joined the IBI Foundation's board of directors the previous year, helping us develop protocols for supporting victims of family psychological abuse. "How are you feeling about the conference next week?" she asked as we settled into our usual seats. The National Conference on Family Financial Abuse was something I'd been planning for months. We'd invited victims, legal experts, mental health professionals, and policymakers to spend 3 days discussing systemic solutions to inheritance exploitation. It would be the largest gathering of its kind, and I was delivering the keynote address. Nervous, I admitted, but ready. I keep thinking about all the people who won't be in that room because they don't know yet that what they're experiencing is abuse. Every policy we develop, every resource we create, every story we share could be the thing that helps someone recognize their situation and take action to protect themselves. You've come so far from the woman who fled Phoenix in the middle of the night, Dr. Martinez observed. Sometimes I feel like that woman was a different person entirely. But then I remember that she had the same instincts, the same capacity for recognizing truth, the same determination to protect herself. She just didn't have the resources or the confidence to act on what she knew. What would you tell her, if you could go back? I considered the question seriously. I'd tell her that her perceptions were accurate, that her family's behavior really was as manipulative and wrong as it seemed. I'd tell her that documenting everything was the right instinct and that trusting herself was the most important choice she could make. And I'd tell her that what felt like the worst thing that could happen would actually become the foundation for something much more meaningful than the life she was living before. After Dr. Martinez left, I had lunch with Rachel Kim, the former trust administrator who'd first provided evidence against my family. She'd become the Foundation's Director of Financial Investigations, using her expertise to help other victims understand complex trust structures and identify signs of financial manipulation. "I've been reviewing the applications for the Emergency Relocation Fund," she said as we shared a salad at a restaurant near my office. "We've got 12 new cases this month, and they're getting more sophisticated. Families are learning from the prosecutions and finding subtler ways to maintain financial control. What kinds of tactics are you seeing? Emotional manipulation instead of outright fraud. Families convincing beneficiaries to voluntarily sign over control of their inheritances by claiming it's temporary or for tax purposes. Creating artificial emergencies that require immediate access to trust funds. Using legitimate mental health concerns as leverage to gain financial authority. It sounds like we need to expand our educational programs." Definitely. And we need more legal partnerships in different states. The laws vary so much from jurisdiction to jurisdiction that victims often don't know what protections are available to them. The afternoon was filled with meetings about the Foundation's growing programs. We'd just received a major grant from a philanthropic organization that would allow us to expand our services nationwide. We were planning to open satellite offices in 5 additional cities, each staffed with legal advocates and mental health professionals who specialized in family financial abuse. The most exciting development was our partnership with universities across the country to create educational programs for young adults who were approaching inheritance milestones. We'd developed workshops on financial literacy, legal rights, and recognizing manipulation that were being incorporated into college orientation programs and senior seminars. At 4 o'clock, I had my most important meeting of the day, a video call with James, my cousin who'd fled to San Francisco when we'd discovered our family's plans to target him as well. He'd gained control of his inheritance 6 months earlier and had decided to use part of it to fund a documentary about family financial abuse. "Alex," he said, as his face appeared on my computer screen, "I've got incredible news. PBS has agreed to air the documentary as part of their investigative series. It'll reach millions of people." "That's amazing, James. What's the timeline?" "They want to premiere it next fall, which gives us time to include footage from your conference next week." They're particularly interested in the policy angle, how victims are working to change the systems that failed to protect them. The documentary had become James's way of processing his own experience and contributing to the broader movement for reform. He'd interviewed dozens of victims, legal experts, and reformed perpetrators to create what early reviewers were calling a comprehensive and compelling examination of a hidden epidemic. "Have you decided what you want to call it?" I asked. "Trust Betrayed, A Family's Greatest Theft," he said. "The tagline is, when family becomes the enemy, trust becomes a weapon." I like it. It captures both the emotional and financial aspects of what these families do to their children. "Speaking of which," James continued, "I wanted to run something by you. The producers want to end the documentary with an update on where you are now, how you've transformed your experience into advocacy. Would you be comfortable with that?" I thought about it for a moment. In the 2 years since the criminal cases had concluded, I'd become increasingly comfortable with public speaking and media appearances. The Foundation's work had given me a platform that felt meaningful rather than exploitative, a way to use my story that served a larger purpose. "Yes," I said finally. "I think that would be powerful, especially if it helps people understand that survival is possible, that victims can reclaim their power, and build something positive from even the worst betrayals." That evening, I drove to my house in the mountains outside Denver, a modest but beautiful home I'd purchased with part of my inheritance the previous year. It was the first place that had ever felt completely mine, decorated with my own choices, filled with books and art that reflected my actual interests rather than what someone else thought I should like. I'd learned to cook during my first year of freedom, finding something deeply satisfying about creating meals for myself, about choosing what to eat based on my own preferences, rather than performing happiness at family dinner tables. Tonight, I made a simple pasta with vegetables from my own garden, eating while watching the sunset behind the mountains that had become my refuge and my home. After dinner, I settled into my home office to review my keynote speech for the conference. I'd written and rewritten it dozens of times, trying to strike the right balance between personal narrative and policy advocacy, between acknowledging the pain of family betrayal and celebrating the possibility of recovery and empowerment. The speech began with my story, but it quickly expanded to encompass the broader patterns we'd identified through the Foundation's work. Family financial abuse followed predictable patterns: isolation, gaslighting, documentation of normal behaviors as pathological, escalation of control, and ultimately, exploitation of trust funds or other assets. Understanding these patterns helped victims recognize their situations and take protective action. But the speech also focused on solutions. The new legislation would create safeguards that hadn't existed when I was trapped in my family's scheme. The Foundation's resources provided support that previous generations of victims had never had access to. The growing awareness of family financial abuse meant that fewer people would suffer in silence, believing they were alone or crazy. Recovery from family financial abuse isn't just about getting your money back, I'd written in the conclusion. It's about reclaiming your sense of reality, rebuilding your capacity to trust yourself, and discovering that your worth isn't dependent on other people's approval or validation. It's about learning that the people who tried to convince you that you were broken were wrong, and that your instinct to protect yourself was right all along. The next morning brought a surprise that reminded me how far I'd come and how much my life had changed. My phone rang while I was having coffee on my back deck, and the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Ms. Thompson, this is Agent Rebecca Foster with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I'm calling about the Hayes Network prosecution. My stomach tightened automatically, even though I knew the criminal cases had been concluded. Is everything all right? More than all right, Agent Foster said, and I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. I wanted to let you know that we've just arrested the final member of the network, the person who was recruiting families and training them to exploit their children's inheritances. It's taken us 2 years to build the case, but we finally have enough evidence to charge him with racketeering and conspiracy. That's incredible news. How many people was he responsible for targeting? Based on the evidence we've gathered, at least 300 families were recruited over a 5-year period. Conservatively, that represents over 800 young adults who were either successfully exploited or targeted for exploitation. The scope was staggering. My family hadn't been outliers or desperate people who'd made a terrible mistake. They'd been part of an organized criminal enterprise that had systematically targeted young trust fund beneficiaries across the country. There's something else, Agent Foster continued. This final arrest was possible because of the advocacy work you've been doing. The Inheritance Protection Act created new reporting requirements that helped us trace the network's activities. And several victims came forward after seeing your foundation's resources, providing testimony that sealed the case. After we hung up, I sat on my deck processing this news. The criminal who'd recruited my family, who'd identified me as a target and trained them to manipulate and exploit me, was finally facing justice. It felt like the closing of a chapter that had been open for too long. But more importantly, it validated everything the foundation had been working toward. Our advocacy hadn't just helped individual victims, it had contributed to systemic change that was actively preventing future exploitation. The conference the following week exceeded every expectation I'd had. Over 500 people attended, including victims, family members, legal professionals, mental health experts, and policymakers from across the country. The energy in the convention center was electric, charged with the shared understanding that we were addressing a problem that had been hidden in shadows for too long. My keynote address was scheduled for the final day, after 3 days of workshops, panel discussions, and networking sessions. I'd had the opportunity to meet dozens of other victims, each with their own story of family betrayal and eventual empowerment. The diversity of experiences was striking, but the common threads were unmistakable: the gaslighting, the financial manipulation, the systematic erosion of trust and autonomy. Standing at the podium, looking out at an audience filled with people who understood exactly what I'd been through, I felt a profound sense of belonging that I'd never experienced with my biological family. 2.5 years ago, I began. I was living in my childhood bedroom, being monitored and manipulated by people who claimed to love me, while they secretly planned to have me falsely committed to a psychiatric facility so they could steal my inheritance. I felt isolated, confused, and increasingly unsure of my own perceptions. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Today, I stand before you as the founder of an organization that has helped over 2,000 victims of family financial abuse. I live in a home I chose, surrounded by people who respect my autonomy and support my goals. I have work that feels meaningful, relationships that are built on honesty rather than manipulation, and financial security that no one can threaten or exploit. I went on to describe the policy victories we'd achieved, the resources we'd developed, and the community we'd built around supporting victims and preventing future exploitation. But the most important thing I want to share with you today, I continued, is that your instincts about your family's behavior are probably right. If you feel like you're being manipulated, gaslighted, or financially exploited, trust those feelings. Document everything you can. Seek independent professional support. And remember that choosing your own welfare over your family's comfort isn't selfish or ungrateful. It's necessary and healthy. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but what moved me most were the individual conversations afterward. Person after person approached me to share their own stories, to thank me for speaking publicly, to ask for specific advice about their situations. One young man, probably about my age, waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching. "Ms. Thompson," he said quietly, "my family has been pressuring me to sign over control of my inheritance because they say I'm too immature to handle it responsibly. After hearing your speech, I realize that I'm not immature. I'm just unwilling to let them control my life." "Trust that instinct," I told him, handing him a card for our legal aid clinic. "And remember that maturity isn't measured by compliance with other people's expectations. It's measured by your ability to make decisions that serve your own long-term well-being." 6 months after the conference, I received a letter that crystallized everything the foundation had been working toward. It was from a 19-year-old college student named Emma, whose parents had been systematically manipulating her mental health treatment to maintain control over her trust fund. "Dear Ms. Thompson," she wrote, "I attended your conference last spring, and it changed my life. I realized that my parents' behavior toward me wasn't normal family concern. It was financial abuse. I used your foundation's resources to find an independent therapist, document my parents' manipulation, and ultimately gain control of my inheritance. But more importantly, I learned to trust myself again. I'm writing to let you know that I'm starting a support group for college students facing family financial manipulation, and we're using your foundation's materials as our guide. Thank you for showing me that survival is possible and that victims can become advocates." That letter now sits framed on my office wall, next to similar messages from dozens of other people who'd found their way to freedom and empowerment. Each one represents not just an individual victory, but progress toward a world where family financial abuse is recognized, addressed, and prevented. Last month, I celebrated my 27th birthday by hosting a dinner party at my house, surrounded by the chosen family I'd built over the past few years. Dr. Martinez was there, along with Rachel Kim, several foundation staff members, and other advocates who'd become close friends. James joined by video call from Los Angeles, where he was premiering his documentary at a film festival. As we raised our glasses in a toast, I thought about the life I might have had if my family's plan had succeeded. I would have spent my 25th birthday in a psychiatric facility, my inheritance being depleted to pay for treatment I didn't need, my sense of reality shattered by people who claimed to love me. Instead, I was celebrating with people who respected my autonomy, supported my goals, and valued my contributions to work that mattered. I had built a life that reflected my actual interests and values rather than performing a version of myself that made other people comfortable. To families that protect instead of exploit, I said, raising my glass. To chosen families that value truth over control, and to the courage it takes to trust yourself when everyone around you is trying to convince you that you're wrong. The foundation continues to grow, our resources reaching more victims every month, our advocacy contributing to policy changes that protect vulnerable beneficiaries. But the work that matters most to me happens in the quieter moments. The phone calls from people who are just beginning to recognize their family's manipulation, the emails from victims who are planning their own escapes, the messages from survivors who are rebuilding their lives on their own terms. Each conversation reminds me that the choice I made to trust myself over my family's version of me was the beginning of everything that came after. The documentation, the escape, the legal battles, the advocacy work, the legislation, the foundation. All of it grew from that initial decision to believe my own perceptions rather than their gaslighting. Sometimes people ask me if I miss my family, if I regret the choices that led to their imprisonment and our permanent estrangement. The answer is complicated. I miss the idea of having a family that loved and supported me. But I don't miss the reality of living with people who saw me as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be valued. What I've learned is that family isn't just about shared genetics or childhood histories. Family is about people who celebrate your successes without jealousy, who support your goals without trying to control them, who respect your autonomy even when they disagree with your choices. The family I've built, my colleagues, my friends, my chosen community of advocates and survivors, provides all the love, support, and belonging that my biological family never could. And unlike the family I was born into, this family was built on a foundation of honesty, respect, and mutual empowerment, rather than manipulation and control. As I write this, sitting in my office overlooking the mountains that have become my home, I can see the future I'm building extending far beyond my own recovery. The Inheritance Protection Act is being expanded to include additional safeguards. The foundation is opening new offices in major cities across the country. The documentary is being adapted into a limited series that will reach even more potential victims. But the most important work is happening in individual lives, in the moments when someone realizes that their family's treatment of them isn't normal or acceptable, when they decide to document the manipulation instead of accepting it, when they choose their own welfare over their family's comfort. Every person who recognizes family financial abuse and takes action to protect themselves is proof that the patterns can be broken, that victims can become survivors, and that survivors can become advocates for others who are still trapped. My story began with a family who tried to convince me I was mentally ill so they could steal my inheritance. It became a story about recognizing manipulation, gathering evidence, and choosing freedom over comfort. But ultimately, it became a story about building something meaningful from betrayal, about transforming personal trauma into systemic change, about discovering that the strength to save yourself can become the foundation for helping save others. To anyone reading this who recognizes their own experience in my story, your instincts are probably right. Your family's behavior probably isn't normal. You deserve autonomy, respect, and financial security. And most importantly, you have the power to choose yourself over their control, even if that choice comes with a cost. The family that tries to convince you that you're broken is often the family that's actually broken. Trust yourself. Document everything. Seek independent support. And remember that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who claim to love you, but treat you like an enemy. Your freedom is worth more than their approval. Your sanity is worth more than their comfort. Your future is worth more than their control. Choose yourself. Choose truth. Choose the life you want to build rather than the life others want to build for you. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.